Hey everybody, this is Pastor Andy, and I am really thankful that you're able to join us online. And my prayer for you is that God's Word would stir your heart deeply this week. While I'm glad that we're able to produce this content for you, I do want to say these videos are not meant to be a substitute for God's good plan for you to be part of a community of faith. Here at Lakeview Church, we believe that the church is not just a content producer, but it's a spiritual family. It is that community of faith, that fellowship of believers. And our calling is to follow Jesus together for the glory of God and the common good. So we'd love for you, if you're able, to be part of our community of faith. We'd love to get to know you, to hear your story. We'd love to partner with you in the gospel. And so if you're in the area and you're able to join us in person, we would love to see you and to meet you. If you're not able to do that, we would highly value your prayers. And thank you for partnering with us in the gospel by praying for us. So I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope God's Word speaks to you deeply. May God bless you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
I've got a couple of questions this morning. They sound really rhetorical, and I know no one likes the easy, obvious questions to start a sermon, but I'm going to do it anyway. Who here, when you pulled into the church parking lot today, believed that when you hit the brake pedal, your car was going to stop? Most everybody. Some of you are very pessimistic. Yeah, we believe it's going to happen. Even if there's a time when you hit that brake pedal and it went to the floor and it didn't stop your car, you don't really think about that. You believe that it's going to stop your car because it's done it thousands and thousands of times before, and that one or two times was obviously just a fluke, so you don't even think about it. Another rhetorical question, still looking for answers. Who here believes that Jesus was raised from the dead? Good job, church people. Why do you believe that? Somebody shout it out. Because it says so in the Bible. That is a great answer, and that is the answer why we believe it. But sometimes we have doubts. Sometimes those questions creep up, and who here has doubted? You know, whether Jesus rose from the dead, whether that's just a little piece of your faith. Actually, hands up. You know, we're not Baptists. Let's get the hands up in the air. I was Baptist for a while, so I can make that joke. Okay, keep the hands up a second. I want everyone to look around for a second. We often think that people at church are like these goody two-shoes people who have it all together. Every one of us have doubted here. So if you're sitting here this morning thinking, you know, I'm not as good as these people I'm sitting around, we've all been there. We've all had those doubts. When we have those doubts, it's often helpful for us to have some answers as to, you know, if we question whether Jesus rose from the dead, the reason we should believe is because the Bible tells us that, and we ought to believe what the Bible says, even when we don't truly fully understand it. But when those doubts come, sometimes it's helpful to have answers beyond just the text of the Bible. And that's what we're going to look at today. And it's actually a good thing to dig into the facts of did Jesus actually raise from the dead? Because if he didn't, that's a huge problem for our faith. Deuteronomy 6:5 says to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. When Jesus reiterates this command, he adds, with all your mind. To worship God with our minds means to worship him in our thoughts and in the ways we think. God never asks his people to believe in him with blind eyes and an irrational mind. He does actually just the opposite, because science, history, archaeology, philosophy, all the studies, they all point back to God when they're understood from a biblical worldview. When we exercise reason in the right context, it is worshipful to God because it shows that not only are we attempting to love God with our minds, but it shows that we care enough about him to ask those hard questions and to search for the answers. When we dig deep into these fields looking for reasoning for our faith, we will inevitably come out the other side with a deeper relationship to God. So why should we believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Because the Bible said so. But is there historical fact, is there studies done that give us that answer to our doubts when we are doubting, is what the Bible says actually true? And there is. So the question we're going to ask today and we're going to answer is, how can we have confidence in the resurrection? I forgot to mention that you're probably handed a little sheet in on your way in. We're looking at the facts of the resurrection today. This is a little bit different than the way we often preach. So that's just to help you kind of follow along with where I'm going, and also something that, maybe this week you start having doubts about something, about is God good? Is God real? Does God see me where I'm at? And maybe we're not going to talk about exactly your situation today, but there are answers out there, and hopefully these things can help encourage you in those times of weakness and doubt. I often end my messages with a main takeaway. We're going to do it here at the beginning to kind of show where we're going today. My main takeaway is that the facts are only a means. The truth is the end. We must either worship or reject the one who is truth. We're going to talk through the facts, but they're only the means. They're not the end of the story. It's not where we plant our flag. The truth is where it all ends, and we must either worship or reject the one who is truth. So just a little bit of background is we have to ask the question, why does it matter, or does it really matter? Paul answers this for us in 1 Corinthians 15, where he writes, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation is in vain, and so is your faith. Moreover, we are found to be false witnesses about God, because we have testified wrongly about God that he raised up Christ, whom he did not raise up, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised." And here's the key, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins." If the resurrection didn't happen, none of this matters. If the resurrection happened, we're all wasting our time here this morning. If the resurrection didn't happen, then we shouldn't be giving our money to Lakeview or to any other cause. We shouldn't bother wasting our time on a Sunday morning. This building shouldn't exist. Lakeview as a church should not exist. No church anywhere should exist if the resurrection didn't happen. If it didn't happen, we might as well just all leave right now and beat all the Methodists to lunch, because there's no hope for us. There's no reason to keep on sitting here and listen to me blabber on for a while if none of this is true. But we will see here in just a moment that there are a lot of reasons beyond even just what the Bible says to believe that it is true. We also need to remember, though, that we cannot prove that the resurrection happened any more than we can prove that Yahweh God is the one true God and that he does truly exist. I think there's a lot of good arguments out there. I think that we look at all the arguments and all the facts, the best conclusion is that God does exist and that Jesus did raise from the dead. But the point of asking these questions and looking at the answers is not to win the argument. It's not to own the other side. It's not to have that one-liner that can completely shut down the haters. That's not the point. The point is to build us up in those moments that when we are doubting, and to be able to have answers for people who honestly are asking questions. In our society today, it's a lot of times not that. It's people wanting to debate and people wanting to argue, but there's a lot of people out there that are asking a lot of hard questions, and when we don't have the answers for them, that's a problem. Also, as we look through the historical evidence today, we have to rely mainly on testimony. We don't have artifacts from past events, per se, that happened in ancient history, so we have to rely mainly on the testimony of the people who were there to see it. Gary Habermas says, "In the ancient world, one comment can be enough to make something historical because we don't have so much from the ancient world." So with all that in mind, let's take a look at what the facts are about the resurrection. First one, we all know this, but let's look at it from a historical standpoint. The tomb was empty. If the tomb wasn't empty, this is a huge problem for the story of the resurrection. Even most skeptics will agree that the tomb was empty, but they'll have different theories on why it was empty. This might simply be because, and I would argue that it definitely is, because of a worldview that says that the more that you accept the facts of the resurrection, the closer you have to get to say it did happen. At some point, if all the facts are true, then the whole thing is true. So at some point, they draw that line. And so some people will say that it wasn't empty, but most, even the skeptics, even the atheists, will say that Jesus' tomb was found empty. This is obviously a huge problem because if the tomb was not empty, not only the resurrection, but everything that happens after it pretty much falls apart if there's still a body in the tomb. And from the very beginning, even the opposition party knew that the tomb was empty. In Matthew 28, 11 through 15, it says that as they were on their way, some of the guards came into the city, and they reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders and agreed on the plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, "Say this: His disciples came to us during the night and stole him while we were sleeping. If this reaches the governor's ears, we will deal with him and keep you out of trouble." They took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been spread among the Jewish people to this day. We have to remember that the book of Matthew was not written 2 weeks after the resurrection. It was written a couple decades later. So when he says it's been spread around until this day, he's saying that this wasn't like a rumor that was going around on Twitter on Tuesday, and by Thursday we knew it was false. No, he's saying for years upon years, decades on decades, that story has been spread among the Jews. And amongst all the other obvious problems, or maybe not obvious, but there's a lot of problems with that passage, it presupposes that the tomb was indeed empty. We can debate beyond that, but even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. Another key point is that it was first reported by women, and we see this in the Gospels. This fact makes no sense if it wasn't true because of the view of women in that time and culture. Their testimony did not fit that requirement when crucial testimony was needed. They were looked down upon. This was back in the days before wives thought that it was acceptable for them to interrupt their husband's stories because we weren't telling it quite right. That was a joke for all of you that are sleeping. But it was first reported by women. They weren't used as witnesses for crucial evidence. And so to hinge all this on the women being the first ones would be a really ridiculous point to make if it wasn't true. So like I said, most skeptics agree that the tomb was empty, but they'll disagree on why. So if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then there has to be a reason why the tomb was empty. So there's a couple of different theories that, aside from Jesus rising from the dead, the first is that they went to the wrong tomb. This is clearly a possibility right off the bat, but it doesn't hold water long term. Luke 23:55 through 56 said the women who had come with him, that's Jesus, from Galilee, followed along and observed the tomb and how his body was placed. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So from the get-go, they planned to return, so it's unlikely that they would have forgotten where they were going to return to. Obviously still possible, but we have to then assume that the women, the 12 apostles, Joseph and his helper that prepared the body, and the Jews never bothered to go to the right tomb and investigate, is the tomb in fact empty? I saw a Babylon Bee article this week. It said, tragic. Every single AR-15 in the nation suddenly lost in a boating accident. Now, if we just assume that was actually a headline, you think the federal government would be like, oh, well, I guess our job on gun control is done. Let's dissolve the ATF and move along. No, if that was actually being reported as true, the federal government would not be too slow to investigate and tell us why that was false. The Jews would have done the same exact thing. They wouldn't have said, oh, somebody said the tomb was empty, I guess it's empty. No, they would have definitely gone and observed to see if the tomb was in fact empty. Furthermore, somebody would have done it in the decades that followed to see if there was a body in the tomb. Another theory is that the body was stolen, which, again, logically speaking, could be a potential. It's not absolutely impossible, but there's absolutely no evidence that it ever occurred. Grave robbers would have stolen any valuable items that might have been put in tombs, such as the pharaohs and then the pyramids, where they put a bunch of gold in there with them. They wouldn't have stolen a body. There would have been no reason for them to steal a body. We also have to ask, what about the guards, the stone that was rolled in front of it? They have to get past that. Also, why were the grave clothes both left behind and folded? So, just logically speaking, we got to think here. If they left the grave clothes behind and folded, their thought process had to be, hey, we can't just steal him. We got to do it naked. And also, we don't want to leave the tomb a mess that we're robbing, so let's fold the clothes up nicely before we leave. Does that make any sense to anybody? If the disciples stole the body while the guards were asleep, like the Jews said, how would the guards have known it was the disciples? And finally, the disciples nor any other of Jesus' followers expected a resurrection to happen. This wasn't part of their idea. Jesus tells them point blank multiple times that he's going to rise from the dead, and they still don't understand. They would have had no motivation to promote this idea if it didn't happen. So the first fact is the tomb is empty. The second fact is that Jesus appeared after the resurrection. Most skeptics will agree that the disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them after the resurrection. And that's worded very carefully because they won't admit that Jesus appeared, but they will admit that the disciples believed he appeared. But if we look at the facts, the best explanation is that Jesus actually did appear. One of the reasons is people claim to physically have touched Jesus' body. That's a huge point against the disciples simply believing or hallucinating. We'd have to argue then that the four Gospels are unreliable, but also some, if not all, of Paul's epistles, which most scholars would not write all of Paul's epistles off. Also, Jesus appeared to both believers and unbelievers, both individually and in groups of hundreds. James, his brother, and Paul were both very adamant unbelievers at the time that Jesus appeared to them. So for them to have hallucinated something or whatnot would have been just very unlikely because, for one, it'd have to be groups of hundreds of people hallucinating all at the same time, which is pretty ridiculous, but also many people he appeared to were not expecting him. Even on the road to Emmaus, they don't even recognize that it's Jesus. That's hard to explain away other than Jesus actually being there. William Lane Craig, in his book On Guard, makes the point, to be perfectly candid, the only grounds for denying the physical, bodily nature of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus is philosophical, not historical. Such appearances would be miracles of the most stupendous proportions. A lot of big words in that quote. What William Lane Craig is saying, that the only reason to deny that Jesus rose from the dead physically, and that he appeared after that resurrection is because people have a bent before they even look at the facts to say, I'm not going to believe this, or I don't believe that miracles happen, or whatever it may be. And so then they write off the rest of the story because they don't want to come to the face-to-face with the facts. So it's not a historical argument. It's just people's predisposition on what they already believe. He's saying that to argue away all of these things by just natural means would be a bigger miracle than Jesus rising from the dead. And it's hard to argue that. The tomb was empty. Jesus appeared after the resurrection. And the third one is that the 12 disciples had an absolutely monumental shift. What would cause these timid disciples to suddenly become these giant pillars of the faith? Even the critics, even the atheists agree that the appearances, regardless of what caused them, is what made the 12 change. Craig Blomberg asked the question, what motivated a group of devoted Jews to change what they believed to be the eternally immutable Sabbath or day of rest and worship from Saturday to Sunday? What led them to declare Jesus to be both Lord and liberator, despite his death by crucifixion, already interpreted in light of Deuteronomy 21:23 to represent God's curse, and how the Jewish expectation of all people being raised from the dead together at the end of time in Daniel 12:2 allowed them to declare Jesus to have been raised in advance of Judgment Day and separate from the general resurrection. What he's saying here is that these aren't just small, like little church debates that the disciples had. This is not the should we do more hymns or more contemporary music? Should pews versus chairs? Should first service start at 8:30 or 9 o'clock? These are very small little debates that we have, and not to say that they don't matter at all, but in the grand scheme of things, they're not huge. Nobody in 150 years is going to remember that in January we switched our service times. It's not that it doesn't matter, but it's really not a big shift. These shifts are absolutely massive. This is like akin to Andy getting up here next week and saying, hey, we're just going to stop doing baptisms. We decided that the staff needed a hot tub, so we're pulling out the baptism pool and putting a hot tub in for staff meetings. I have suggested that, and I have gotten shot down. But these are just absolutely massive shifts in both belief and practice from where they were before the resurrection, and there has to be an answer as to why they would suddenly make these huge changes. They witnessed the crucifixion process. The only thing that would have convinced them that Jesus had actually resurrected was a resurrected Jesus. I mean, just think about being the disciples in Jerusalem that week. You see Jesus be spit on. You see him be beaten. You see him with the crown of thorns. He's beaten half to death. He has to carry that cross out to Golgotha. You see him get nailed to it. You see him die. You see that spear go into his side. You see the blood and the water come out. What on earth? I mean, if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, like imagine seeing that image, but in real life, what on earth would make you think that was coming back to life in a glorious way? The only logical explanation for why they believed that the weak, dead, bloody Jesus came back to life in this glorified, resurrected body is that he actually did so. If what they were preaching is false, they had absolutely nothing to gain and they had absolutely everything to lose. They're to some extent like the first preachers of the gospel. There's no Kenneth Copeland or Benny Hinn, millions and billions of dollars out there in private jets. That's not even on the table. There's no money involved. There's no fame involved. They have no reason to make up this story and preach it if what they were preaching was fake. They all, except for John, were all martyred at the hands of Rome. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose if they were knowingly preaching something that was false. But if it was true, they had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Now, some have compared the apostles being martyred to something in modern day like the jihadist Muslims or kamikaze pilots in World War II or the Nazis, who they all give their lives for something that they believe to be true. Habermas and Licona, in their book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, note that modern martyrs act solely out of their trust in beliefs that others have taught them. The apostles died for holding to their own testimony that they had personally seen the risen Jesus. Contemporary martyrs die for what they believe to be true. The disciples of Jesus died for what they knew to be either true or false. We all like to say that if it came down to it, we would die for our faith. And, I just like you, I hope I would too. But what that would be is a belief in Jesus. They died knowing that what they believed was either true or false. There's virtually no historical record of people dying for what they knew to be a false cause. They might be brainwashed, they might not be in their right mind, but everyone who dies for a cause believes it to be true. The disciples of Jesus were the only ones who knew whether it was true or false, and they were mostly all martyred. Those are just 3 simple facts of the resurrection. There are hundreds more, but Andy said I'm not allowed to preach a 9-hour sermon today. But just with those 3 individual facts, there's no logical or alternative for any of them. Many simply just disregard the evidence for their preconceived worldview, like I noted before. They take the facts, they don't care, they want to move forward, they don't want to believe in Jesus, and so they try to find ways out of it. Not only is there little evidence for any other theory as far as one individual point goes, but there is not a single theory that encapsulates all the different details of the resurrection. It just doesn't exist, and it will never exist, because we can't. There is no argument. There is no logic there. Chuck Colson, like many of us, was proved that the resurrection is true because of Watergate. That was a little slow, but I'll take it. Chuck Colson was one of the associates or one of the assistants to Richard Nixon during Watergate. He ended up going to prison after that whole thing broke and ended up coming to Christ then and became a very prolific pastor and preacher. But in his autobiography, Born Again, Chuck Colson writes, "I know that the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it." And that is true. We have no record of any eyewitnesses ever recanting their statements. Never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. And that's true. Everything about that is very true. 12 common everyday men, would have not kept alive for 40 years, never once recanting it, even in the face of death, if it was false. So that's the historical evidence I've got today. But what do we do with the facts? Like I said at the beginning, the facts aren't the end. We can look at the facts and go about our lives, but we have to respond to the facts in a certain way. I think the best way to explain what do we do with the facts comes from a court case in 1992. It was one of the most watched court cases in American history. Marines Lance Corporal Harold Dawson and Private First Class Loudon Downey were accused of the murder of Private William Santiago, and they faced murder charges and a court-martial. As the investigation and the trial progressed, it became clear that although they were guilty, they were also given an order from their commanding officer. At one point during the trial, the JAG lawyer for the defendants, Daniel Caffey, puts the Colonel Nathan Jessup on the stand, and he says, "Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?" The judge says, "You don't have to answer that question." Jessup says, "I'll answer the question. You want answers?" Caffey says, "I think I'm entitled." Jessup says, "You want answers?" Caffey says, "I want the truth." And Jessup responds, there we go. I'm going to put this speech up on the screen because I think it actually very much shows where we're at here with these facts. Jessup says, "You can't handle the truth. Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as a backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand at post. Either way, I don't care what you think you are entitled to." What he's saying in that speech is that we can debate the facts all day, but there's a bigger truth that's surrounding it all. The facts are the facts, but there's something much bigger at hand. Now, in the movie, Jessup is wrong and he's thrown in prison, but the point still remains that the facts are not the end. There is a much bigger truth that we have to come up against. We must face the facts. 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 21, this is the end of the passage that we started off with. Paul writes, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man also has come the resurrection of the dead." We have only two options. If Jesus resurrected from the dead, if those facts are true, whether we want to believe it or not, we have two options. The first one is to ignore it. We can ignore it in a couple of different ways. We can be indifferent to it, or we can be indignant about it. We can say, sure, it's a historical fact. I don't care. I'm going to move on with my life. The Battle of Marathon by the ancient Greeks didn't really affect my Tuesday. Neither is this whole story. Or we can be indignant about it. They say that atheists believe two things. That one, there is no God, and two, I hate him. And we can have that same mentality of, I'll look at the facts, but I hate God, and so I'm going to do everything I can to work against him. We can ignore it, or we can live in light of it. Those are the only two options. There is no middle ground. What does it mean to live in light of it? It means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Here at Lakeview, we like to talk about that being 3 steps of come to Jesus, be transformed by Jesus, and share Jesus with others. And that's not a one-time check the box and done thing. If we're living in light of it, we constantly need to come to Jesus. We constantly need to be transformed by Jesus, and we constantly ought to be sharing Jesus with others. I do want to point out that this doesn't mean that we never doubt. We all raised our hands at the beginning of the service. We've all doubted. We might be doubting right now. We probably doubted this week something at some point. It doesn't mean that we never doubt, but the question is, what do we do with our doubts? John 20:24-29, this is the passage of doubting Thomas, as it's often referred to. Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were telling him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "If I don't see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will never believe." A week later, his disciples were indoors again, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless, but believe." Thomas responded to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said, "Because you have believed me, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." That's us. We can't die for what we know to be true or false. We can only die for what we believe to be true or false. I think Thomas gets a little bit of a bad rap here. We don't really know, actually, from this passage, is Thomas saying, "I refuse to believe until I see him"? Or is he saying, "This is just so out there, I can't believe it until I actually see it"? We don't know. Maybe it's an active, "I don't want to believe it." Maybe it's a passive, "I just simply can't." And maybe you're there today too. Maybe you're in maybe you're angry with God and you don't want to believe him. Maybe you want to believe him and just feel like you can't. Maybe you're like the father in Mark 9:24 who cried out to Jesus, "I do believe, help my unbelief." I think that's where a lot of us who are saved, we're there all the time. We just don't even recognize it, or we just kind of ignore it. We do believe. If you're a saved believer in Jesus Christ, you do believe. But we all have moments of unbelief. And we need to stop looking at our doubts, at our sin, at our temptation. We need to stop looking at it as though, "Hey, I got this. I'm strong enough." We need to stop with the mentality of picking ourselves up by the bootstraps, because each and every one of us, myself included, we are weak. God is strong. The doubts are not the sin, but we need to bring our doubts to Jesus and let him change them. We're not going to change them. Jesus can. When we have those doubts, we need to bring them to him and cry out to him, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." As the worship team comes back up, there's one last piece of historical evidence that we didn't talk about because it's not quite as airtight, but it's called the Shroud of Turin. And here's a picture of it right here that probably doesn't look all that interesting to you right off the bat. A shroud is a burial cloth they used back in that era. They'd bury the body in this shroud, and they would put it in the tomb for upwards of a year or so while the flesh would decompose. Then they would go in later, collect the bones, and put them in an ossuary. So this shroud, the historicity of it being a shroud is almost absolutely certain. Scientists do agree that the image of the shroud is because of the radiation from the dead, crucified body that's underneath, and it could not be reproduced with modern technology. It was originally claimed by scientists that it originated in the 13th century due to a study in the 80s. In just this year, in August, a month and a half ago, a story broke that they used X-ray dating techniques on this shroud and found that it was 2,000 years old. People, we are a decade away from 2,000 years exactly from Jesus' resurrection. It has the image of a man who was crucified. There are over 120 wounds on the chest, legs, and the back, which match the beatings of Jesus. There's a stab wound on the right side with blood and serum having leaked out, and there's puncture wounds on the head that are consistent with a crown of thorns. So if we take this picture and you invert the colors, this is the picture that you actually get on this shroud. And if you see there's a head in the top middle there. And if we blow that picture up, this is what that head looks like. And that, more likely than not, is the face of Jesus. Because of the times in which we live, somebody decided to feed it into some advanced AI software and said, "Hey, take this image and tell me what that face would look like," and this is what came up. Now, I don't know if that's what Jesus looked like. To me, that looks a little European, a little white, looks a little stereotypical of a lot of pictures of Jesus. But that could be it. We potentially, for the first time in 2,000 years, know what Jesus looked like. And I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that we most likely have the burial cloth of Jesus, we have some sort of the outline of his face, and we have a picture that could potentially, possibly be what Jesus actually looks like. But do you know what the coolest thing about this whole thing is? It's that it exists today. And I don't even mean that the fact that it was able to travel 2,000 years without being destroyed. I mean that unless the Bible is true and the clothes were left in the tomb, that thing doesn't exist. That thing does exist. It's in Italy right now. And that only happens if the tomb is empty and Jesus rose from the dead. We don't need all the answers. These are some answers that I hope will help you, hopefully might help people you know. But we don't need the answers. As a child in the back of the room said to begin the service, the reason we believe is the Bible. That is the reason we believe. It's not because of the facts. It's not because of this picture. It's because the Bible tells us the truth. These answers ask us a question. Here are the facts. Will you place your faith in the truth? God loved you, he loved me, he loved us so much that shroud made it through 2,000 years. We have the testimony of people who saw Jesus crucified and rise from the dead. We have some answers. God loves us so much, he doesn't tell us to follow him blindly. He reveals himself to us each and every day. But he's asking us the question today. Here's the facts. Will you place your faith in the truth? Believing a fact does nothing. Believing the truth does everything. Joshua 24:15, but if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today. Which will you worship? The God your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River, or the God of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. What are you going to choose today?